Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Sense and Sensibility. By Jane Austen. Sense and Sensibility, first published in 1811, is a novel about two sisters and their diametrically opposed approaches to love. It was originally titled Eleanor and Marianne and was written by Jane Austen as an epistolary tale. Sense and Sensibility was Austen's new working title when it was finally sent off to a publisher. After the success of Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility was published anonymously as by the author of Pride and Prejudice for the second time. We find a man on his deathbed in the late 1790s. Despite his good nature, he failed to make enough provisions for the care of his wife and daughters after his death. Despite inheriting a sizable fortune from his uncle, Mr. Dashwood only lived to see his uncle's death by a year. On his deathbed, Mr. Dashwood entrusts the care of his stepmother and three half-sisters to his adult son from his previous marriage. The son, on the other hand, is readily swayed by his wife, ignoring his father's instructions. A relative of Mrs. Dashwood's gives her and her girls a cottage in the country. The women make do despite the drastically decreased living conditions compared to what they were used to. While the girls are in London, one of the sisters has a whirlwind relationship and the other has a peaceful and unproductive romance. As a result, both sisters' hearts had been broken to a greater extent than they were before. In classical literature, this story has been hailed as one of the most enduringly popular. After his sister's death, Nerlawn Park's owner was left feeling alone. For the sake of his family's well-being, he asked the heir to move in early. Mr. Henry Dashwood, his wife, and their three daughters looked after the park and their elderly uncle for 10 years. Mr. Dashwood's son John would bring his young wife and infant boy to visit on occasion. Respectable young man, ancient uncle fell in love with the tiny boy because of his demeanor. Mr. John Dashwood's mother, Mr. Henry's first wife, had left him a sizable inheritance, and he had also married well. Mr. Dashwood wasn't worried about his son, John, because his first wife had brought a sizable dowry, but he did want to preserve something for his second wife and daughters, because they were next in line to inherit Nerlawn Park. Sadly, he barely lived another year after his uncle passed away. The women were left with a meager sum that their uncle had set aside for them because he had been unable to secure anything else for them. Mr. Dashwood's dying wish was to have his son talk to him as he lay dying. In the wake of his son's guarantee that he would care for his stepmother and half-sisters, Mr. Dashwood passed away. The women's lives had been utterly ruined by the news. Mother and daughter, Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne, shared their sorrows. They were dejected, shutting themselves off from the rest of the world and lamenting the cruel hand of the universe. This left Eleanor, the eldest daughter, to take care of the house and Margaret, the youngest daughter. As a result, Eleanor was left with the task of greeting Fanny Dashwood when she finally arrived. Dashwood's wife Fanny was a self-centered, socially conscious individual. In her new role as Nerlawn Park's mistress, she swiftly relegated the female guests to the guest rooms. In the blink of an eye, they were compelled to begin searching for a new place to live. I had a hard time finding one. They could no longer afford Mrs. Dashwood's previous lifestyle. To keep her mother's extravagant spending in check, Eleanor was always sensible. Mrs. Dashwood had hoped that her stepson's remarks to his father, Mr. John Dashwood, would prompt him to help them, but he was going to disappoint them. Having talked it over with his wife, Fanny, his generosity had dwindled down to helping them relocate and occasional presents of fish and game. During their search for a new place to live, the women were guests at Nerlawn Park. When Edward Ferrars, Fanny Dashwood's eldest brother, arrived to visit, it was a happy occasion. Edward, despite his shyness and lack of beauty, was a good person. Eventually, he overcame his timidity and became a favorite of Mrs. Dashwood and her girls, especially Eleanor, with greater exposure. The personalities of Edward and Eleanor were a perfect match from the start. Eleanor's pragmatist nature melded with Edward's aloof one. A strong bond formed between the two of them, and they were often seen together. Because she cared about her daughter's happiness, Mrs. Dashwood saw and approved of the proposal. Her sister Eleanor's attraction to a man of such a gentle character was something Marianne couldn't understand, but she was glad for her anyhow. In spite of Eleanor's assurances to her sister that the two of them had no intention of getting married, her mother and sister, Marianne, sensed romance. Fanny, on the other hand, was not happy about it. Mrs. Dashwood was told by Fanny that her mother would not approve of the match. Edward was created to be married off to someone better suited for him. Mrs. Dashwood got a letter from a Devonshire cousin while she was boiling about Fanny's callousness. When Sir John heard of his cousin's plight, he decided to offer a cottage on his land to accommodate him. It was a little on the tiny side, but would work well for women. Mrs. Dashwood was eager to avoid her stepson's wife, and Eleanor agreed to the arrangement because it was cheaper. Having lived under the same roof for several months, Mrs. Dashwood had finally had enough. The Dashwood women set off for Devonshire and Barton Cottage without the support of John Dashwood. In order to promote the friendship between Eleanor and Edward, Mrs. Dashwood had requested Edward to visit them whenever he could. There was less of the melancholy in the cottage after Eleanor sent the only 2 retainers she could afford. In spite of its diminutive size, the women quickly transformed it into a comfortable home with their indomitable spirit. Pianoforte Marianne placed an ideal position in Eleanor's drawings on the wall. When they arrived at Sir John Middleton's estate, they were greeted by a gift of veggies from his garden and the man himself. Sir John was an outgoing 40-year-old. As a result of his generosity, he was delighted to have the beautiful Dashwood women join the ranks of his guests. It was Lady Middleton's invitation to Barton Cottage, which she accepted, and she'll be there as soon as she's confident she won't be an annoyance. Sir John insisted that the ladies join him and his family for supper the next night, and he would not leave until he was assured that they would be present. Barton Park, a magnificent estate just a few miles away, was also close by. Conversations about her 4 children brought Lady Middleton out of her shell, according to the Dashwoods. Lady Middleton's mother, Mrs. Jennings, and Colonel Brandon, a longtime friend and neighbor, were also introduced to them at dinner. It was the ladies' opinion that Mrs. Jennings was rude and petty. Her demeanor was a little sloppy at times, but she was never mean-spirited. She was as cheerful and outgoing as Sir John most of the time. Compared to this, Colonel Brandon maintained his composure and serious demeanor. His military demeanor remained intact when he neared the age of 35. Even the Dashwood women would have respected him more if it weren't for Mrs. Jennings' mocking. Marianne was asked to play a song on the piano at the Middletons' house after supper. After seeing Colonel Brandon pay such close attention to the music, Mrs. Jennings deduced that it was an indicator of his feelings for Marianne. Marianne was so angry by this that she chose to despise both Mrs. Jennings and Colonel Brandon. Marianne and Margaret enjoy a stroll around the countryside on a beautiful day. They're particularly interested in Allenham, a gorgeous estate just over the hill. There is a hill that separates them, but they still prefer to sneak a peep at the house from the top of it because it is owned by a partially reclusive elderly woman. Sadly, the rain had started, so the 2 young women had to rush back down the hill. Turning her ankle was Marianne's fate. Rescued by an attractive young man, she is now safe and sound. When confronted, he confessed that his name was Willoughby and that he was in town to see his aunt, the owner of Allenham. He carried Marianne down the hill to her house after discovering she couldn't walk due to her injury. He introduced himself to Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor after dropping her off on the sofa. Then he left, promising to return the next day to see how Marianne was doing. In Marianne's eyes, she was odd. He was her hero in shining armor. Sir John told the ladies that he didn't know anything negative about them. Willoughby also had a wonderful hunting dog and enjoyed dancing. He wasn't very attractive to the girls at first, but the fact that he enjoyed dancing was a sign of his class and refinement. As the days went by, Willoughby and Marianne became more inseparable. He and she were completely enamored with each other. Colonel Brandon was clearly unhappy, but Eleanor knew he only cared about Marianne's happiness. While Willoughby frequently refers to Colonel Brandon, he made a habit of complaining about how uninteresting the colonel was and finding methods to berate him for it. Eleanor always disagreed with Willoughby's criticisms of the colonel when he brought it up around her. In spite of his attractiveness and gorgeous looks, Eleanor occasionally felt Willoughby to be careless and impulsive. There were no flaws in Willoughby for Marianne. She had fallen head over heels in love with the man she was dating. It seemed like Willoughby and Eleanor were in love, therefore Eleanor couldn't understand why it was taking so long for them to announce their engagement. Especially after Allenham's incident. This exquisite estate is held by Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law, and Sir John has made plans to take a group of them there. It seemed like a great idea at the start of the day, given the pleasant weather. A last-minute telegram required rapid action from Colonel Brandon. The trip had to be postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. Despite their disappointment, the group took carriage excursions around the area. After berating Colonel Brandon in front of Marianne and Eleanor, Willoughby set out on a solo run with Marianne in his carriage. Eleanor was horrified when she learned that the two had gone by his aunt's house without her permission during the day. Marianne chastised her sister for her transgressions, but she was deaf when it came to Willoughby. Their mother was there as well. Willoughby's goodness and gentlemanliness were obvious to Mrs. Dashwood. She was confident that everything would be okay after he and Marianne got married. Eleanor was once again the only one who was able to think on her feet. Eleanor's manner puzzled Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood. Nobody could figure out why Eleanor wasn't wasting away in her grief over Edward, her long-lost love. Because Edward had not made a formal proposal to Eleanor, despite her admiration for him, she had not placed all her expectations in him. Margaret had unwittingly revealed Edward's existence to Mrs. Jennings. Mrs. Jennings was joking with the girls about their former lovers in their lawn during dinner one night. In Margaret's opinion, Eleanor needed someone with the F in his last name. Although humiliated, Marianne confirmed it by correcting Margaret's peskiness, making it much worse. The romance between Marianne and Willoughby continues to blossom, until one fateful afternoon. After a long day at work, Eleanor and Mrs. Dashwood return home to find Willoughby distraught in front of the fireplace, and Marianne running up the stairs in tears. He explains that he has to go to London for work and that he won't be back until next year. Following his departure, Mrs. Dashwood breaks down in tears. Eleanor was left to ponder what would happen when the other women had all burst into tears. How involved are they? Mrs. Dashwood is certain they are secretly engaged, but she is not going to tell Marianne that she knows this for certain. She sees it as a lack of faith on her part. Eleanor's curiosity will be satiated for the time being. Marianne indulged in the melodrama that comes with an unrequited lover's absence, against her better judgment. She rarely had time to rest or eat. Singing, reading, and anything else that brought her memories of Willoughby made her cry sporadically. Marianne began to believe her theories about Willoughby's leaving after about a week. While out for a walk with Eleanor, she noticed a rider approaching. It's Edward, after all. Even though she was disappointed that it wasn't Willoughby, Marianne couldn't help but smile when she saw Edward. She hoped to catch a glimpse of Eleanor and Edward's passionate affection for one another. Marianne, despite the fact that their relationship appeared to be more like a friendship than a romantic one, was always keeping an eye on him. It seemed to her that the ring he wore was fashioned of Eleanor's hair. She prayed that was real even though she couldn't recall ever allowing him access to her hair for the purpose of making a ring. Edward's demeanor was initially altered. At first, he was less than friendly, but as the visit went on, he got more friendly and upbeat. The Miltons insisted on hosting him for dinner when he was staying at Barden Cottage. Mrs. Jennings took advantage of this window of opportunity to learn his last name was Ferrars and to tease Eleanor about the mystery Mr. F, who had been a long-time admirer of hers. As Edward became more at ease among the Dashwood women, he spent some time catching up on their news and learning more about Willoughby. "Do you still hate second loves as much as you used to?" he inquired of Marianne. Marianne remarked that at the age of 17 she had all of her beliefs in place. "How can you explain your father's affection for your mother, his second wife?" Eleanor pressed Marianne. After a week or so, Edward had left. The fact that he couldn't follow his passion for work left him with no clear direction in sight. While his family expected him to achieve greatness, Edward was content to work in a peaceful, low-key job. He wanted to be a preacher, but his family and friends were opposed to the idea because of his religious beliefs. As a result, Edward was left to wander aimlessly from place to place in a state of despondency. Edward's departure came as a surprise to Marianne, who had expected Eleanor to shed a tear or two. She simply returned to her normal routine. The routine continued until Charlotte Palmer, Lady Middleton's sister, and her husband arrived. We couldn't have been more different. Her husband, on the other hand, was old, handsome, and stoic. Despite the fact that she thought his wit to be droll, she also found him to be snarky and harsh. He frequently chastised her for being naive. Mr. Palmer coldly grabbed up a newspaper to read and disregarded them all on their first visit to be introduced to the Dashwoods. Because Mr. Palmer is campaigning for parliamentary representation, the two of them will be traveling together shortly. The next two guests are two young ladies whom Mrs. Jennings believes to be related to her. Both Anne and Lucy Steele are stunning young women, with Lucy being the more youthful and hence more attractive. Their first encounter with Eleanor and Marianne leaves them cold. Lady Middleton's children are adored by the Steele sisters to the point of annoyance. They made an effort to become part of the community in Barton Park. Worse, it appeared that neither of the sisters had any formal schooling. There were no women in Anne's or Lucy's chats, and they were even less interesting. The Steele sisters, on the other hand, appeared to adore the Dashwoods. In particular, Lucy made an effort to grow closer to Eleanor. As Sir John teases Eleanor about Edward, Lucy's efforts to get into Eleanor's life become more apparent. Let Eleanor know that Lucy and Edward have been engaged for quite some time. Despite her shattered heart, Eleanor listened attentively as the story of how Edward and Lucy met was told while he was attending school in Longstaple with her uncle. Edward proposed to her 4 years ago when he was a student at her uncle's school. Lucy presented a little locket with his picture, some letters, and the identity of the hair in his ring as proof of his relationship with her. When Marianne questioned Edward about it, he said it belonged to his sister, although it was actually hers. The news broke to Eleanor, but Lucy was kept in the dark. As long as she was alone, Eleanor was able to keep her emotions under control. Lucy was happy that she didn't have to inform her mother and sisters because Eleanor had been sworn to secrecy. Because of his apparent deceit, they would have been hurt. According to Eleanor, Edward was undoubtedly captivated with Lucy at the time of the proposal and was trapped when he realized what a folly it was to attach himself to such a stupid girl with little fortune. Eleanor's conclusion: they would have to wait until Lucy acquired his mother's money before they could get married. Edward will be disinherited by Mrs. Ferrars if Lucy and Edward declare their engagement, she believes. Lucy spent as much time as possible with Eleanor to show off her relationship with Edward. Eleanor and Marianne accepted Mrs. Jennings' invitation to London, but Lucy wasn't happy about it because she saw Eleanor as a potential rival. Jennings asked the Dashwood girls to follow her in a light-hearted manner, as she always does. She vowed to find them husbands because her own 2 daughters were married and she enjoyed having the companionship of their husbands and their children. The first time Eleanor was offered the opportunity to spend time with Mrs. Jennings, she turned it down. Marianne, to her astonishment, wanted to join her. If Marianne knew where Willoughby was staying, Eleanor had a plan to catch up with him. In light of her new knowledge, Eleanor was apprehensive about running into her brother and his wife in London at the time, and was unsure how she would respond. The fact that Anne and Lucy would also be in London and traveling in the same circles as Eleanor made her nervous. On the long journey, Marianne largely ignored Mrs. Jennings, instead relying on Eleanor for company and good manners. Marianne wrote a letter as soon as they got in London. She was not going to share this information with Eleanor, no matter how much she wanted to. When Eleanor didn't reveal her sentiments towards Edward, Marianne interpreted it as an act of betrayal on her part. Marianne and Eleanor would keep their relationship a secret if Eleanor would. Eleanor awaited the consequences of Marianne and Willoughby's engagement, still apprehensive of the outcome. Is he going to hurry over to her? It is Colonel Brandon, not Willoughby, who is on the scene. Even though Marianne is grumpy and leaves the room, Eleanor is overjoyed to see him. It's once again her job to show that they are polite despite Marianne forgetting to do so at times. That the Palmers were in town as well, he told Eleanor of. Sir John hosts a ball for them all a few days later, and they all show up. Marianne was devastated to find Willoughby had declined the invitation and therefore missed the party. There will be a modest get-together with Mrs. Jennings a few days later for the girls to attend. She hopes that it will brighten up Marianne. Marianne, on the other hand, notices Willoughby with a group of friends, including a young woman who appears to be friendly. When Marianne makes a spectacle of herself in order to grab his attention, he has no choice but to come over and stop her. He greets them with a frigid smile before walking out the door. Marianne is in a state of utter devastation. Her immediate removal is required. Unfortunately, Mrs. Jennings is a compassionate woman who quickly orders the coach and departs the party along with the girls. She is to be commended for this act of kindness. Marianne eventually receives a letter from Willoughby the next day. She'd written him again the night before when they returned, thinking that he'd received some sort of slanderous allegation about her. In addition to the letter, he enclosed a lock of her hair and the note she had written to him. He wrote that he hoped she didn't get the incorrect idea about his intentions in his note. In the near future, he would marry Sophia Gray. When word gets out, Mrs. Jennings realizes why Marianne is crying all the time. Marianne's kind heart tries to cheer her up in a number of ways, including a little meal. Marianne, on the other hand, leaves the table early, while Eleanor carries on the conversation. Eleanor discovers that Willoughby married Miss Grey because of her wealth. After hearing the rumors of Willoughby's engagement, Colonel Brandon came to check on Marianne the following day. He finally told Eleanor his story while they were alone together. His father had taken him in when he was a child and he fell in love with one of his wards. However, her father wished for her to marry Brandon's older brother, so she obliged his wishes. Brandon enrolled and departed for the East Indies with his battalion, which was devastated by the loss of a loved one. They had a terrible marriage. Brandon's brother turned on his wife after his father's death, and she developed feelings for another guy as a result. She vanished after their divorce and didn't reappear for several years. His sister-in-law and true love Eliza had been missing for some time, so Colonel Brandon returned home to seek for her. At the time of his discovery, she was reported to be suffering from terminal illness in a sponging house, a place where debtors were held, just short of prison. She had been dumped by the man she had left with, and he had taken all of her money. Even her small stipend was transferred to another person. Colonel Brandon took her into his home and cared for her, where he learned she had an illegitimate child from her first relationship. When she begged him to take care of her daughter, he did so. Brandon, who didn't have a place of his own, looked after the girl's financial needs and ensured that she went to school. He inherited the family estate after his brother died, and Colonel Brandon made it a point for his ward to see him frequently at Delaford when she wasn't in the care of one of the about 4 or 5 young women who had been assigned to look after her while he was away at work. As a result, she would be able to gain the female authority that males believed young women required. For the sake of one of the daughter's ailing fathers, she had to travel to Bath. Brandon trusted him and didn't see anything wrong with his ward going along with her pal. After a few days, he learned that the girl had gone missing. She was ultimately found after months of seeking. That day in October, he received a letter from her telling him where she was. Willoughby was the father of the child Brandon discovered in her womb. Willoughby had no idea that Brandon was departing to take care of the girl he had pregnant when he whined about missing their day excursion to the country. Brandon looked after her and helped her find a place to live with her child. Brandon had hoped for a change of heart after learning about Marianne's alleged engagement to Willoughby. But he wasn't, as was evident. Willoughby had just shattered the heart of yet another girl. Since no one was hurt, they had to duel in a field, as required by honor, but the outcome was kept quiet. The Willoughby Eleanor had imagined is vanished, and Marianne is devastated when she hears the story. It was too late to save his character. Despite Marianne's strong desire to return home, they are unable to do so due to a letter they received from their mother. Her heart breaks for the girls, too, but she recommends them to stay in London for a little while longer. When their brother arrives in London, she'd like to spend some time with him and his family. Her stepson's wife, on the other hand, has different plans. John Dashwood swings by to see his sisters when they move to London with Mr. and Mrs. Dashwood. Eleanor should marry Colonel Brandon, he tells her. If his mother can persuade her son to agree, he assures her Edward will marry the affluent Miss Morton, if she will allow him to do so. Marianne's declining beauty, he says, means she has less options when looking for a wealthy husband. He also wants her to be closer to Mrs. Jennings, the wealthy housewife. Fanny Dashwood threw a dinner party for Mrs. Jennings, the Middletons, and Colonel Brandon instead of inviting her husband's sisters to stay with them. Lucy and Anne Steele were also invited because they were staying with the Middletons. When Mrs. Dashwood first met Lady Middleton, she was initially charmed by her money and affluence. However, Eleanor's mother, who was present, was downright unpleasant to her. Mrs. Ferrars intended to express her displeasure at Edward's apparent affection for Eleanor. Naturally, she was kind to Lucy because she didn't know his real fiancé was present. This gave Lucy a fresh sense of hope for a wedding that was sooner than she had expected. Most of all, when Mrs. Dashwood requested that they join her and Anne for a few days. Fanny's friends Eleanor and Marianne were supposed to be staying with her at another social gathering. Fanny had already invited the less fortunate Steele sisters to stay with her, so she promptly responded she would. She appreciated their amiable demeanor. Particularly when they gushed over her infant son, she felt smothered. When Anne sees Mrs. Dashwood and her mother talking about how much they admire Lucy, She casually drops the bombshell that Edward and Lucy are engaged. Fanny became hysterical and ejected the girls from the house. If Edward didn't deny his relationship with Lucy, Mrs. Ferrars threatened to take away his inheritance. Upon declining, he was escorted out of the building. Lucy was informed of Edward's financial difficulties and given the option to call it quits, but she refused. The saying goes, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. When Mrs. Jennings heard about what had happened, she came running to tell Eleanor. Eleanor was able to tell Marianne about the engagement because it had become public knowledge. She was heartbroken at first that Eleanor had withheld this information from her. It seemed to Marianne that Eleanor's love for Marianne might not be as strong as she thought. Eleanor, on the other hand, quickly dispelled that belief. Marianne was in awe of Eleanor's strength and made a promise to herself that she would do her best to mimic her. The sisters want to travel a portion of the way with the Palmers, who will be departing soon, in order to go back home as quickly as possible. Colonel Brandon, on the other hand, stops by Eleanor's house before they leave to ask her to pass along his offer of the Delaford Rectory to Edward. Obviously, this isn't a great salary, but at least we'd have something. She is ecstatic with his generosity, but a little nervous about being the one to provide it. Edward appears as she is drafting a letter to him. He appreciates Brandon's offer, but he has a sneaking suspicion that he's courting Eleanor. Eleanor makes a final visit to her brother before the sisters depart for home. She learns that Edward's inheritance has been given to Robert, his scumbag brother. The sisters will be departing soon, accompanied by Mrs. Jennings, the Palmers, as well as Colonel Brandon. Soon after, before heading to Barton, they'll stop for a few days at the Palmers' estate. Marianne spends her time there going on long, depressing walks and getting caught in the rain. Because of that, she contracts a nasty cold that quickly worsens. Her mother should be contacted, according to the doctor. To get her back, the colonel heads out. Marianne's health improves during his absence. It's a surprise to Eleanor to see Willoughby instead of her mother and Colonel Brandon in the carriage. Quickly he arrived after hearing of Marianne's impending fate. His unsavory acts are revealed to Eleanor when she informs him that Marianne is okay. With Marianne, he had fallen in love to the extent he could. Despite the fact that he had spent all of his money in inefficient ways, he still intended to marry Marianne when he received the proceeds of his aunt's estate. But on the day he departed, his aunt found out about Colonel Brandon's war and their baby, and he was devastated. Infuriated, she reacted in a rage. Unless he married the girl, she wouldn't allow him to stay in the house. He was forced to leave when he refused to comply. He departed to marry Miss Grey because he had her and her money tied up. Since he had no intention of altering his lifestyle, a wealthy marriage was the only alternative available to him. I didn't realize that she was pregnant, he confessed. I thought I had left her contact information, he insisted. His fiancée also dictated the letter of separation he sent to Marianne. Willoughby begged Eleanor's pardon and requested her to tell Marianne as soon as she felt ready. Forgiveness and sympathy were Eleanor's words. Colonel Brandon and their mother returned shortly after he had departed. They were ecstatic to learn of Marianne's recovery from her illness. They ultimately returned to Barton after a few days' absence. Colonel Brandon had confessed his love for Marianne to Mrs. Dashwood on their perilous journey from Barton, as Mrs. Dashwood had told Eleanor. Everyone hoped that Marianne would one day be able to reciprocate his feelings for her. Marianne's state of mind improved dramatically after her health was restored. The more grounded romance. Marianne was relieved to learn from Eleanor that Willoughby did love her, but that he couldn't accept a life without money as a way to express his feelings. Colonel Brandon's generosity and stoicism quickly won her over. Lucy Steele's marriage to Mr. Ferrars was announced during this time period. Even Eleanor, who had been expecting it, was shocked, but she wasn't surprised. They were all taken off guard when Edward showed up a few days later. When he told them that Lucy had broken her engagement and married his brother, Robert, they were surprised. Finally, he could propose to Eleanor, the woman he adored, and ask her to be his wife. She agreed to it. When Colonel Brandon learned Edward and Eleanor were getting married, he increased his investment in the vicarage. Soon after, Eleanor and Edward moved in. As a result of their marriages, Marianne and Brandon were neighbors. Even though Eleanor didn't expect it, Mrs. Ferrars showed Edward her forgiveness by giving him the identical gift she'd given to his sister on her wedding day. Margaret became a favorite of Sir John's gatherings and Mrs. Jennings' pranks at Barton Cottage, where Mrs. Dashwood and Margaret continued to reside. Eleanor Dashwood, the eldest daughter of the Dashwood family. She had just turned 19 at the start of the story. She was the more logical of the two of us. She never lost her cool when she fell head over heels in love with Edward Ferrars. Before the very end of the book, she never made an emotional outburst of any kind. Her counsel was sound throughout the book. Neither frivolous nor flimsy was she in any way her character. Even after her heart had been broken, she was able to control her feelings. Marianne Dashwood, the middle Dashwood daughter. At the start of the book, Marianne is 17 and incredibly attractive. The more sensitive of the two sisters, she was. She proudly wore her heart on her sleeve. Her feelings for Willoughby were never a secret to her. They were infatuated, and he could see it in her eyes. She fell ill as a result of his breakup with her. She was often the focus of attention because she was such a theatrical person. Marianne was a romantic who had no time for anyone who disagreed with her on anything. True love, she insisted, only comes along once in a lifetime. However, by the end of the book she had matured and become more stable. Out of everyone, she has gone through the most growth. Edward Ferrars, brother-in-law to Eleanor's brother. He proposed to a young girl he was smitten with as a young guy. It was later that he regretted it, but he was too honorable to break up the relationship. When it came to his family, he didn't get along. His mother was a strict disciplinarian who insisted he choose a career that would bring honor to the family name. Peer promotion material that she can be proud of. Edward, it turned out, had aspirations of becoming a priest. He didn't want to be a snobby gentleman who squanders money and looks down his nose at everyone. He was drawn to Eleanor's steadfast, even-tempered demeanor when he first met her, but because he was engaged, he was unable to pursue his feelings. He felt restless and depressed the entire time. For the first time since Lucy and Eleanor's engagement broke off, he was finally free of his mother's influence and able to lead a normal life. John Willoughby, handsome, charming, and shallow. With all his heart, he tried to win her over, but when his aunt threatened to disown him and cut him out of her will, he turned and left her without saying goodbye. He cared for her, but money was more important to him. She was the ward of Colonel Brandon, and she was impregnated by him. He ran away from her. As soon as the proposal was accepted, he married the wealthy girl in London and gained her fortune, all the while lamenting the loss of Marianne. Unsatisfactory relationship. Colonel Brandon, his story is the shortest in telling, yet the most interesting. A beautiful young woman with a large dowry piqued his interest as a young guy. Every time they attempted to run away together, they realized that his father had other plans for her. Until she consented to the marriage, they were returned forcibly and abused. Their lives went from bad to worse once she wed her brother's brother. He didn't care for her and presumably didn't like women in general. He didn't care about her, either. It was only a matter of time until she found a new lover. After she lost all her money, her life descended into depravity, and she gave birth to a daughter before passing away from sickness. As a ruse to avoid seeing the lady he loved with his brother, Colonel Brandon had enlisted in the military. When he returned home, he found that she had left his brother, who had divorced her, because she was unhappy. Brandon searched for her for years before finally finding her as she lay dying. For her sake, he removed her from the poorhouse and sought out the greatest possible care for her. Her last request to Brandon was to watch over her daughter before she passed away, which he gladly obliged to. The girl was reared by him in a stable and loving environment, but she met Willoughby. It was after he had taken her, seduced and fathered a child together that he ran away with her. She was on the verge of giving birth when Brandon came across her. In addition to providing her with a home, he cared for her and her baby. He was infatuated with Marianne throughout the novel. The same qualities that attracted him to his first love still drew him to her. Despite his admiration for her, he was well aware that she would never return his affections. He only wanted Marianne to be happy since he loved her so much. Brandon would help her if it meant marrying a scumbag like Willoughby. Brandon was concerned when Willoughby broke her ear. To make sure Marianne was safe, he spent more time with the sisters. In the event that Marianne took ill while on the trip, he was there to bring her mother back home. Brandon's perseverance paid off in the end. He finally got the girl after a long time of waiting. Marianne was his wife. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.